We are recording today's session, and we will have a copy of the slides today available for you all on CSN's website once we are done today. Usually it takes about a day or so to get those up, but we will have those available in case you miss it or you have to hop off early. We will have 2 poll questions at the beginning just to get a sense of who you are and where you're coming from, who's on the line. And we do appreciate your feedback. We don't have a formal evaluation at the end today since it's a bit of a hybrid presentation compared to the way that we usually do our webcasts. But that said, please feel free to drop any questions that you have throughout the presentation in the chat box. And if you have any feedback, you can always either put it in the chat or feel free to email me after the fact. You can reach me at wood.csn@outlook.com. So just a couple of updates since it's been a little while. I believe our last webcast was back in May. We had a really busy spring. So in case you missed some of our webcasts earlier this year, we had over a dozen sort of in the first half of the year. So we've been taking it easy this fall. But we do have a lot of work that we put out during the summer, including new guidance for stream restoration protocols 2 and 3. The stream restoration BMP under the Chesapeake Bay program, TMDL. Really comprehensive, good new document here that updates information on qualifying conditions for the practices. It goes through the latest science and recommendations for improving the way that protocols 2 and 3 are calculated. For those who aren't familiar, that's in-stream denitrification and floodplain reconnection that is achieved through stream restoration. So it was approved by the Chesapeake Bay Program Office in October, so that is new on the streets. I recommend you check that out if you have not already. We do hope to have a webcast on that before the year is over. I'm working on planning that right now and should have something for you all in December. We also have been doing a lot of work on climate resiliency in stormwater. There are 2 new memos that are part of a 4-part memo series that we've been working on over the past year. The second and third in that series are now out and available for you to read. The second memo is a review of the stormwater engineering standards and criteria across the Chesapeake Bay watershed, sort of a state-by-state look at the different design guidance that is available under the current climate conditions, as well as looking at some of the climate data sources that inform those modeling and design work. And then the third memo, for those of you who are interested in sort of a review of the climate projections for the Chesapeake Bay watershed region, is sort of a synthesis of a number of studies, both at a larger global and regional scale, but also the work that's been done to downscale precipitation projections for the Chesapeake Bay watershed in order to develop localized projected intensity, duration, frequency curves that can be used for stormwater design. So it's a bit of a hot topic in the stormwater field right now as we're looking to improve and maintain the resilience of our stormwater practices. So these are sort of a building effort as we move towards hopefully, either a next generation of design or more resilient techniques in our practices that can help them withstand future climate conditions. So those are both available to read now. We have a 4th one that will be coming out before the end of the year, looking at BMP vulnerability analysis and potential impacts on the performance of our practices due to climate change. And then last but not least, I'm excited to announce that our Best Urban BMP in the Bay Awards contest, the BUBBAs, is back for its 5th year. The contest will be opening on December 7th is what we're shooting for right now. But start thinking about the projects that you've done over the last couple of years that you'd like to showcase and feature that you think could be in the running. It's a great opportunity to promote your work and connect with all of our network members, over 11,000 stormwater professionals around the watershed. We have a couple of tweaks this year. There's a new category for innovations in stormwater permit implementation, which is really an opportunity to showcase the things that you're doing, maybe a little bit more behind the scenes that really make your programs hum to get those practices in the ground or address other challenges that you might be having in your municipality or jurisdiction. We also, in addition to our $5,000 grand prize this year, are rolling out a $3,000 Small But Mighty Award to try to provide an incentive and an opportunity for communities that maybe are operating a little bit more on a shoestring budget, but are doing some really creative and innovative work to get practices in the ground. So there are more details available at the website listed. As I mentioned, we will be starting to accept projects in December, and that will stay open all the way until February. So you'll have plenty of opportunity to hear from us more on the BUBBAs and to get your projects in. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and put up two polls for you all back to back. The first is just to let us know who you're representing today. Are you with a local government, private sector, regulatory agency, nonprofit, academia, or other? The second poll question usually asks you how many people are watching today, since we expect a number of folks to be in an office, perhaps in a conference room, although that is not the case. So you only have one choice today in terms of how many people are watching with you. And I hope that that answer captures all of you. All right. Thank you all for filling that out. It looks like everyone is social distancing. And it looks like we have quite a few local government folks today, which is great to see. I can show you all what we're looking at there. Okay. So we'll go ahead and move along. I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's speakers, and then I'm going to turn it over to them for the rest of the presentation today. I'm really excited to have Aaron Porter and John Jastrom with us from the USGS Virginia and West Virginia Water Science Center today to share these presentations. They've both been working with the USGS for a number of years now, Aaron since 2014 and John since 2002. And their primary focus has been utilizing stream flow and continuous water quality monitoring to improve our understanding of nutrient and sediment dynamics in small urban watersheds. And so they are here today to talk a lot about their recent work and some of those monitoring results, what they're telling us about nutrients in our small urban watersheds. So Aaron and John, I will turn it over to you. John, I believe you're going first. Is that right?
That's right. Thank you.
All right. I'll stop sharing and it's all yours.
Very good. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity. Hopefully you're seeing my presentation at this point. So today we're going to talk about many different facets of our urban stream monitoring programs that we at the USGS are conducting throughout Virginia. And as I get started on that, I just want to point out that all of these projects are in cooperation with other entities, be it regional commissions such as the Hampton Roads PDC, individual cities like the city of Salem, Virginia, or the city of Roanoke, counties like the county of Fairfax, and even nonprofit organizations like Resource Protection Group, which is a nonprofit focused on advancing stream restoration research. And so, you know, without their support, we wouldn't be able to do this type of work. And we're also very interested in expanding this type of work. So if you're with an organization that has an interest in some of the things you see today, please don't hesitate to reach out to Aaron or myself so we can talk about how we might be able to put something together. So a quick agenda for the talks today. We've got a couple of talks lined up. I'm going to start off with an overview of our urban monitoring program here in Virginia. Then Aaron's going to provide some details from a recently published report about our Fairfax County monitoring network. I'm going to talk a little bit about the next steps for that program and where we're taking the analysis of those data from that monitoring program. Then Aaron's going to tell you more about our Hampton Roads regional monitoring program. And we'll wait till the end and hold discussion till the end. But if you have questions as we go, please go ahead and enter them into the chat. We do have a lot of content today, so hopefully we don't lose track of any questions you may have. So starting things off, urban environments, I think folks in this audience are pretty familiar with the detriments of development on our urban streams, be it alterations to hydrology, which ultimately impact geomorphology and sediment and nutrient loads, and then the biotic communities that live there. You're probably also very familiar with the significant investments that are being made to try to manage and restore these systems. And a lot of times these responsibilities fall to our local governments, who I see are well represented on the call from the poll we just had, so that's great. You know, and really billions of dollars being spent nationally every year to address some of these problems. And this is really where our science comes in to try to do the best we can to inform those efforts and ensure that we're taking the right approaches to tackling some of these problems. So some of the common questions that come up throughout our urban monitoring programs are things like, what are the hydrologic conditions? What are the nutrients and sediment loads? And what are the ecologic conditions in our urban watershed? So kind of where do we stand? What is the status? And then how do these things compare across different physiographic provinces, across just different urbanized areas that may be in close proximity to one another or far from one another? And also, how do they compare to modeled conditions? We use models extensively, particularly from a regulatory perspective. So how does what we're measuring on the ground and in the water compare to what our models are saying? We want to know how these conditions are changing over time. And then mostly, we want to know what's driving those changes. So if conditions are improving, is it the management actions that we're conducting, or is it something else? Or if they're degrading, why are they degrading? So that's really the crux of our questions is what's driving the changes that we may be observing. So the approach that we take to monitoring these urban streams and stormwater systems is what we call intensive monitoring. This is really based on this premise that our monitoring scale, our temporal scale, the frequency of monitoring needs to be proportional to the watershed scale. So small watersheds are going to respond much more quickly to inputs of runoff and so on. So that scaled hydrographic response time requires us to monitor at a much greater frequency than we may need to in larger rivers. And we also have interest in understanding the processes that are driving these things and being able to detect and describe change. So we need very high resolution data sets to be able to do this type of work. So our intensive monitoring typically is based on what we call continuous monitoring. This is often data that are collected every 5 minutes year round. So this is our stream flow information that comes from our stream gauges. And then we employ continuous water quality monitors to measure basic water quality parameters like temperature, turbidity, conductance, pH, and DO. And now we've got sensors that help us to do that continuous monitoring for nutrients such as nitrate with some of the latest advances in nitrate sensors. So continuous monitoring is really the foundation of the approach that we employ in these systems. However, we can't use sensors for everything. So we need to have sampling added on to this continuous monitoring. And so to do that, we often rely on auto samplers to help us catch those very flashy storm flow events. And most of the programs that we're talking today have a focus on nutrients and sediments. So that's what the bulk of our analyses are, with a few exceptions. We then use surrogate methods to compute loads because ultimately we're interested in loads and yields from these watersheds. And so this is an approach where we statistically relate our continuous monitoring data to our high frequency sampling data so that we can compute the most accurate and precise loads and yields possible in these systems to help us better detect potential changes. Additionally, we have ecological monitoring components in some of the studies, and we also have some precipitation monitoring elements that you'll hear more about in just a few minutes. We're doing this work in many locations across the state of Virginia, which really helps us to tackle some of those questions about regional patterns. Our first network that we started in this program is in cooperation with Fairfax County. That's a 20-station monitoring network that we've been operating since 2007. Then we have a program that we started in the Hampton Roads region with the PDC there and multiple jurisdictions where we've been monitoring at 12 locations since 2014. A program in the city of Roanoke where we have 5 stations, some of them starting back as far as 2016. And then we also have a really nice 9-station precipitation monitoring network that I'll tell you more about in just a moment. Most recently, we've added a monitoring station in the city of Salem, Virginia, just this fall. And then finally, we'll soon be adding 2 more stations in Reston, Virginia on some streams that were restored about a decade ago. So what I'd like to do now is just step through and give you just a quick glimpse at some of these programs, and then some of the others we're going to take a deeper dive into through Aaron's talk. So we'll start off down in the southwest corner of the state in our city of Roanoke monitoring program. We've been working in the upper Roanoke River watershed for many, many years. We have multiple stream gauges in that watershed, the oldest dating back to 1896. That's the Roanoke River at Walnut Street. So we have a long history of hydrologic monitoring in that watershed. But more recently, we've been working with the city of Roanoke to help quantify the amount of suspended sediment that's delivered from the city itself to the Roanoke River to help address some TMDL concerns. We've been looking at physical and chemical water quality and potential impacts from the construction of a natural gas pipeline in the headwaters of that watershed. And we've been working to characterize spatial and temporal precipitation patterns throughout the city. So we're looking at in-stream effects of the Mountain Valley pipeline construction. And this ties together two programs that we have. The first is a cooperative program with Virginia DEQ. We're monitoring numerous locations along the pipeline construction pathway. And one of those locations is where the pipeline construction crosses the Roanoke River. So to help the city understand the potential impacts of that upstream construction on sediment transport to and through the city, we're also monitoring a location on the Roanoke River at Route 117, which is on the upstream extent of the city's riverway. So we've been monitoring continuous water quality parameters there since 2018 to help inform that effort. The primary interest in the city is understanding what the city's contributions are to the total suspended sediment load within the Roanoke River and how the city's contributions compare to the contributions of the rest of the watershed. So to address that, we're monitoring multiple locations within the city. We have one on a small urban tributary called Lick Run. We've got the Roanoke River at Route 117, which is the upstream extent of the city. Roanoke River at 13th Street, which is the downstream extent of the city. And then two stations on Tinker Creek, which represent the eastern portion of the city. And so these 5 monitoring stations were selected so that we can separate out basically the load coming into the city and the load leaving the city. So the city can better understand what portion of the total suspended sediment load they're ultimately responsible for and they can affect.
Hey, John, sorry to interrupt for just a second.
Sure.
Your audio keeps kind of fading in and out. I don't know if it's just a mic or what it is, but
okay. I'm sorry. I will do better to speak towards my microphone.
No, it's all right.
So we're additionally monitoring precipitation on a nine station precipitation network throughout the city. And those are those those green circles shown on the map. At these locations, we're measuring precipitation every 5 minutes, and those data are updated online every 5 to 10 minutes. So very much real-time data access. And these data are being used extensively by the city to aid them in the management of their stormwater infrastructure, to improve their emergency responses during flood events, and to inform the public of potential risks of precipitation and flash flooding. We're going to move next door now to the city of Salem, Virginia. This is where we've just recently started a program focused on early warning for water providers. So we're working with the city of Salem's water department, and we've added a real-time water quality monitor on the Roanoke River just upstream of their drinking water intake. And this helps them to manage their water intakes in real time, considering potential plumes of sediment or contaminants from up in the watershed. And they're able to disable their water intakes based on conditions that are observed at the monitoring station that we've deployed upstream. We have a real-time alert system through our NWIS web program, Water Alert, that notifies treatment plant operators in near real time when conditions in the river exceed thresholds that they may be interested in. And so at this location, we're measuring numerous parameters, including our basic water temperature, pH, conductance, DO, turbidity, but we're also measuring fluorescence and FDOM at this location to help identify any potential contaminants coming downstream. And there have been 2 examples recently of why this type of work is important for water plant operators. Over the summer, there was a fuel spill on Tinker Creek nearby in Roanoke. And that was one example of some of the potential concerns for pollution that water providers have. And then most recently, just weeks after we deployed the monitor for the city of Salem, there was a train car derailment where 2,000 tons of coal were spilled into the river just upstream of our monitoring station and their intake. So very timely deployment of our sensors to help understand the potential impacts of that train derailment on the operation of the water plant. Next, I'd like to jump to Reston, Virginia, where we have 2 stations that we'll be deploying this spring in cooperation with the Resource Protection Group. And so this program is focused on measuring and evaluating hydrologic, water chemistry, and ecologic responses to enhanced stream restoration practices on the Snake Den Branch and Glade streams in Reston. So these streams were completely restored by Wetlands Studies and Solutions approximately 10 or 12 years ago. And now there's an interest in augmenting those restorations with additional practices. And USGS will be providing the basic hydrologic, water chemistry, and ecologic monitoring necessary to assess the results of some of those programs. So as part of this program, we'll be monitoring stream flow at 2 locations and precipitation at 1 location. We'll be measuring water quality continuously using our water quality sondes and nitrate sensors. And we'll be collecting individual samples for ions, nutrients, and suspended sediment concentration using those auto sampling approaches that I mentioned earlier. We'll also be evaluating physical habitat in these streams, along with the benthic macroinvertebrate communities and fish surveys. So this is all work that's going to get started this spring and that we anticipate the monitoring for this program to extend for approximately 6 years. Jumping now to the eastern part of the state, our Hampton Roads program with the Hampton Roads PDC. This network was started because of a concern about a lack of data to describe sediment and nutrient loading rates within the urbanized coastal plain and the regulatory requirements that were being put in place without sufficient data. So the objectives of this program are to collect nutrient and sediment data that are representative of the urbanized coastal plain, to compute loads that can be compared to modeled loads. And I'm not going to talk much about this program because Aaron Porter is going to go through it in great detail here later in our presentation this morning. And then finally, we have our network in Fairfax County, which we've been operating since 2007. The objectives of this program, which again will be described in much greater detail by Aaron here shortly, are to generate long-term monitoring data to describe current water quality conditions, trends in water quality, and loads and yields of nutrients and sediments, then to transfer what we learn from intensive monitoring stations to other less intensively monitored watersheds, and to finally evaluate those results in comparison to what's been changed on the landscape and BMPs that have been implemented. So this program is fairly mature at this point. We've got over 12 years of monitoring data. So we literally have millions of individual data records to work with in our evaluations. We had a report that we released in 2014 that provided some initial results and characterizations from the first 5 years of this program. And while we've been doing all this, Fairfax County has been very busy in actively restoring and implementing management practices throughout the county. So currently we have a comprehensive analysis and reporting effort underway. This effort has recently yielded a published report that is a comprehensive analysis of the monitoring data. This is going to be the subject of Aaron's presentation that's coming up next. But this report was authored by USGS staff along with Fairfax County staff and provides a very complete analysis of the monitoring data that we have from this program. In addition to those reports that have been mentioned, we have numerous other publications that have been prepared as part of these programs. We have 2 scientific investigations reports for Fairfax County. We have a fact sheet for the Hampton Roads Network, and we have a fact sheet for the Roanoke River Network. Also, we have 3 publications that are planned in the near future, another report for Fairfax County, a report for the Hampton Roads Network, and a journal article describing some of the work in Roanoke. And finally, I want to mention that this work is really being done by a team. I have the pleasure of presenting the overview today, but there are many individuals engaged in this work, including Aaron, who will be presenting today, Jimmy Weber, and Brendan Foster. And we have a lot of resources online if you want to go online and find out more about these programs after our talk. And we'll put this slide up at the end as well so that you can jot down some of this information. So that concludes my overview of our programs. And now I'm going to hand it off to Aaron so that he can take a deep dive into some of the results from our analysis of data in Fairfax County.
All right, thanks, John. Hopefully you all can see my first slide. There's going to be a little bit of overlap here with some of the things John shared, but a lot of extra info as well. So just one more time, my name is Aaron Porter. I'm a hydrologist with the Virginia and West Virginia Water Science Center, and I run both the Fairfax and the Hampton Roads monitoring programs. So I'm going to kick off this part of the presentation talking about our longest running urban program up in Fairfax County. And as this slide is titled, the broad question, as John said, that this program is trying to answer is how are stream conditions changing in response to best management practice implementations. So having said that, what is the benefit of this program to our cooperator, which is Fairfax County? Well, it's been pretty well established by both Fairfax County research and our own research that the county streams are suffering from many of those classic symptoms of urban stream syndrome. That includes changes in in benthic communities, stream erosion, sedimentation, nutrient loading, and flooding. And the county has made over $100 million worth of investments in stormwater practices to mitigate these urban stressors. And naturally they want to know, if and to what degree water quality is improving at, both the reach scale and the watershed scale, and how best they can direct future investments to achieve their desired results. So monitoring began in 2007. So this is actually exactly what John showed, but I'll just go through it anyways. In the study objectives can best be described in two ongoing phases. So number one, it's just generate long-term monitoring data, to describe basic water quality conditions, to compute trends, to compute nutrient sediment yields and loads, and to monitor stream health based on benthic macroinvertebrate community metrics. And so that's an ongoing phase. And it's essentially the bedrock of the program, but it's built towards the second phase, which is to transfer, what we've learned to less intensively monitor watersheds, and also evaluate relations between, observed conditions and a combination of, BMP implementations, public works infrastructure, land use changes in climate, and other factors. So our approach to monitoring is based on two tiers of monitoring intensity. And the network consists of 20 stations, 5 of which are intensively monitored. So John talked about that a bit. Those are the blue triangles on that map. And there we collect continuous measurements of stream flow and basic water quality parameters, and collect nutrient sediment samples, storm samples using those automated samplers. And we also compute loads here. Then the other 15 stations are termed trend sites. So those are the red triangles. And at these locations, we collect continuous water level data using pressure transducers. And each month we go out manually collect the nutrient and sediment samples, as well as just basic water quality parameters with a sonde. So these sites are primarily used to compute trends in water quality constituents. And for some ongoing work there, we're analyzing that continuous water level data for trends in a few basic hydrologic metrics. And then at all 20 sites, Fairfax County ecologists collect benthic macroinvertebrate samples each spring. And they've recently expanded that to fall sampling as well. And I'll just note that these 20 watersheds range in size from about 1 to 5 square miles. It's also worth noting that, Fairfax County streams are just quite interesting scientifically to study for many reasons. But, one of those is that the county sits across 3 different physiographic regions. So the coastal plain, the Piedmont, and the Triassic lowlands, which is, a sub-province of the Piedmont. And the geologic differences across these regions shows up in our stream flow and our water quality data. Okay, so the report includes quite a lengthy analysis of stream flow, including a number of metrics like annual yields and runoff ratios, base flow and storm flow indices, flow duration curves, annual exceedance probabilities, and then trends. But I'm going to start with stream flashiness, which I think this audience probably knows that term well. But if you aren't familiar with the term, it's a metric that's used to quantify how quickly the storm response occurs. It tells us kind of how stable or unstable the hydrology is. And we know that the flashier the system, the more of a negative effect it can have on water chemistry and biota and stream health. So in that picture at the bottom right, you can see the comparison of a flashy versus more stable hydrographs. And so we use two methods to investigate stream flashiness, a stage or water level based method, which I'm showing the results of here, as well as a stream flow based method. And I chose the stage method here to show because we were able to run this analysis on all 20 of the sites, whereas the flow-based method was confined to those 5 intensively monitored sites where we computed stream flow. And what we found was that, unsurprisingly, flashiness was strongly positively correlated to watershed imperviousness. And this is because rainfall can't infiltrate the ground. It rapidly flows down gradient, and it typically is channelized the stormwater infrastructure that dumps to the receiving stream. We also wanted to investigate if there'd been long-term trends in mean daily stream flow. So we ran what's referred to as a stream flow quantile trend analysis. So it analyzes the trend in each quantile of flow from the lowest mean daily flow ever recorded to the highest, and then everything in between. So it's the first quantile to the 99th. And I know that at first glance, these figures can be a little tricky to interpret. So if you look at the plot in the bottom left, I'll just quickly run through how to interpret them. So the points to the left in that figure represent really low flows that we'd likely observe during periods of drought. The points within the gray shaded area in the middle represent the base flows, those most common flows that are occurring between storm events. And then to the right are the storm flows and the extreme high flows. Now, where those points rest on the y-axis tells us whether they're increasing or decreasing over that period, in this case, 10 years. And if the point's red, then that trend for that quantile is statistically significant. All right, so now look to the right, and we see that there are very few significant trends over these 10 years at the 4 stream gauges that I'm showing. But there's a general pattern of the very low flows increasing and the base flows and the storm flows decreasing. But again, few of those are significant, so we can't actually say that they're truly changing. And this just makes me think that perhaps 10 years isn't a long enough time, to observe measurable changes in stream flow, in many of these highly variable urban streams. But luckily for us, we have 2 USGS Chesapeake Bay non-tidal network stations that are located within within Fairfax County. Both have 70+ year records of stream flow. And these sites allow us to determine, on a longer time scale, how stream flow has changed, across a time period in which, the county transformed from somewhat rural and agricultural in the 40s to today where we find it heavily developed and urbanized. So in the plot to the right, we see that both the extreme low flows and the base flows have decreased, and the high flows or the storm flows have increased. And both of these trends are caused by that development of impervious surfaces, a channelized stormwater infrastructure, and the kind of the soil compaction that results from land development. So these factors reduce groundwater filtration, that's sustaining those base flows. It's enhancing runoff that causes greater storm flows and higher peak flows. Now in the bottom 2 plots, we see those same 2 stations over the last 10 years of monitoring, and we see some similar patterns to our stream gauges that I showed on the previous slide. But again, in general, these trends are not significant in that shorter time period. All right, so switching gears, let's take a look at specific conductance, because stream salinization, is a topic that's getting a lot of attention right now. So in the first plot, we see variability across both sites and seasons. So it's all of our sites there. I know it's a lot of data, but just kind of follow the discussion more than the plots. So I've split the data into 2 seasons, the red and the blue box plots, for warm and cool seasons. And SC was higher in cool months and lower in the warm months, and significantly higher in the Triassic lowland sites and the Piedmont over the coastal plain sites. And also was higher in watersheds with high impervious cover, especially in the cool months. Now, without going into too much detail in this next figure, I'll just point out that conductance typically decreases with stream flow. So this is just a conductance versus flow plot. And this inverse relation is due to relatively high SC groundwater being diluted by low SC precipitation runoff. And like the other figure, this plot is split into seasons left to right. So what we see here is that in the warm season, we get that normal dilution pattern as flow increases. So you can see the arrows there in the top pane to help visualize that pattern. But in the cool months, we see ionic enrichment that we can pretty confidently attribute to wash off from road de-icing salts. Keeping with SC for a moment, let's look at trends across the network. So from the map and the bar chart, those orange bars and the orange triangles, they indicate that we have increasing trends in SC pretty much across the entire network. Conductance increased by about 2.5% per year on average, which equates to about a 7.5 unit per year increase. And the largest increases occurred in the watersheds with the most impervious cover, and more specifically, the most roadways. And these trends, are again likely related to increased use of road salts or the increased delivery of those salts to streams by greater runoff. Of course, another additional factor, I should say, that leads to this is the weathering of building materials like concrete that can also increase conductance. And then this small plot in the middle shows that strong positive correlation between impervious cover and conductance. So for every 10% increase in impervious cover, conductance increased by about 100 units. So more roads means more area in the watershed to apply those salts to in the wintertime, and then greater quantities of runoff produced from those surfaces. And then here's the last slide on SC. The trend method we employed, it allows us not only to calculate annual trends, but also the annual trend within each month. So for example, how has SC changed over the 10 years in the month of January versus February and so on. Now, what we found, really quite interesting because the significant increases at the 14 monitoring stations were most consistently observed in the spring and the fall months, not in the winter when the de-icing salt was being applied, which, would have been my prior leading up to this analysis. And this suggests that the salt being applied is hanging around in the environment and being conveyed to the streams, by subsequent events. In other words, the soil may be quite saturated with these salts. So in the springtime, you get those spring storms washing off the salts applied the previous winter. And in the fall, we typically have droughts, in the mid-Atlantic. So you get older groundwater discharging to streams that may contain chloride that, that slowly move downward through the soil matrix over time. And then also remobilization of those salts during those big fall storms, like the tropical storms and hurricanes that we're seeing more and more of. Now a few key points on phosphorus. So we found that concentrations were significantly higher in the Triassic lowland sites due to the phosphorus-rich geology in that region. As I mentioned earlier, geologic differences across the county affect water quality conditions. This is important to understand these differences when the county is setting goals for reductions throughout the county, or choosing where to implement what sort of BMP strategy. You want to know what that baseline is to know what to expect from your strategy. So phosphorus concentrations were seasonally dependent. We observed higher concentrations in warmer months and attributed this to probably to 2 factors. So first of all, it's the temperature dependent release of orthophosphate from sediments. So Orthophos is released at a greater rate in warm waters. So that's important to keep in mind as we consider the effects of climate change in the coming decades. And then number two, it's the dissociation of phosphorus from metals and organic matter that occurs under low dissolved oxygen concentrations, which we typically observe in summer months due to increased biological activity. And phosphorus concentrations increased with flow, and the composition also changed, which you can see in the concentration flow plots that I just put up on the right. So during base flows, total phosphorus was primarily composed of that dissolved component, but that shifted to soil-bound particulate P at higher flows, which you can see from the color gradient there. And this reflects, the high phosphorus absorption capacity, fine sediments in the county and in the Piedmont region, at large. So now let's look at some phosphorus trends. So phosphorus increased in most streams, but those trends were only significant in 4 sites, where you see the orange arrows and the bars on the box plot. On the other hand, concentrations decreased at Frog Branch, which is that green bar, which is notable because that's where we saw the highest concentrations overall throughout these first 10 years. Phosphorus levels were generally low, so these increases were only about 0.01 milligrams per liter per year, but they were primarily due to increases in the dissolved fraction, namely orthophosphate. Though that does seem low, that's still a notable result because small increases in orthophosphate, of course, can have significant effects on stream health, since it's biologically available for uptake, and the key limiting nutrient in most of these freshwater systems. So the map and the bar chart here, those are based on trends in concentration data, but we also analyzed for trends in loads. And we found that total phosphorus loads increased at Flatlick Branch and Difficult Run. And this was driven by increases in both the dissolved and that particulate fraction. So both slices of the pie increased. But despite increases in dissolved phosphorus at the other 2 sites, South Fork, Little Difficult, and Dead Run, the overall total phosphorus loads didn't increase. And this was due to offsetting reductions in that particulate fraction. And we know that the particulate fraction is that primary component of phosphorus during storm flows, when much of that load is typically being conveyed or transported downstream. So while dissolved phosphorus is pretty consistently increasing across these county sites, some sites are showing reductions in that particulate fraction, which is likely a function of reduced sediment transport. Okay, so now on to nitrogen. So over this 10-year period, we observed a network-wide significant decreasing trend in nitrate, but not in total nitrogen. And this was due to offsetting increases in the dissolved TKN, or total keldon nitrogen, that organic component. And then at the individual station scale, total nitrogen concentrations decreased at 5 stations and increased at 1, which was at South Fork Little Difficult Run. And also nitrate increased at Captain Hickory Run. So both of those watersheds are sub-basins of the Difficult Run watershed. For those of you that are familiar with the county, it's up in the kind of top part of that map. An important factor that those 2 watersheds have in common are a high density of septic system infrastructure. And those systems, the septic systems, show up on the map as the brown dots. And that relation's been made, septic to higher in-stream nitrate concentrations is made in other studies of the Difficult Run watershed as well. And in the bottom right there, you can see that overall there's a strong correlation between the density of septic infrastructure and the in-stream nitrate concentration. But there are, of course, some caveats. So there's very little septic infrastructure in Doe Creek and Dead Run, which I'm pointing out in this figure in that circle. But both had relatively high nitrate concentrations. So that just highlights that, yes, there are of course other important drivers that play in these watersheds. So we don't want to, oversimplify things. For example, in Doe Creek, it's in the coastal plain, so there may be lower rates of denitrification for various reasons. Dead Run is in a highly developed area, and there's some preliminary evidence that may point towards some point source contributions. And then likewise, Captain Hickory, also circled on that figure, had by far, or by some measure, the highest nitrate concentrations throughout the network. But based on septic contributions alone, it should be a little bit lower, more like South Fork Little Difficult. So again, while septic systems are a big factor affecting nitrogen and nitrate in the county, and certainly have gotten our focused attention, there are a number of factors affecting concentrations in these watersheds. So now I'm going to shift our focus to annual loads. So we've been talking a lot about spatial and seasonal patterns and concentration data. So we computed loads at the 5 intensively monitored sites. I've included both sediment and phosphorus loads on this slide because their patterns are very similar and they're just inherently linked to one another. So first, let's note that Difficult Run and South Fork Little Difficult Run yielded more sediment than the other watersheds over the 10-year period. So you can see that in the cumulative load in the top left there, the blue and the green lines. And we know that from other research that's been done in those watersheds that the majority of that sediment comes from stream bank and stream bed scour and erosion. It's really just been, anecdotally, it's been amazing how much those streams have moved laterally and vertically over the study period. Meanwhile, based on what we know about the phosphorus-rich geology of the Triassic lowlands, it wasn't a surprise to find that the Flatlick branch, the orange line in that second figure there, which was also the only intensively monitored site in that region, it yielded substantially more phosphorus than the other watersheds. So now if you'll look to the right, for both constituents, the highest yields came in the wettest years when these streams were storm flow rather than base flow dominant. And that dominant is indicated in the color gradient there. So the darker colors had a greater storm flow index that year. And the highest loads occurred in 2008, 2011, and 14. And that's when storm flow runoff was greatest. As a side note, though, over the course of 2010, we also got a lot of rain. But unlike in 08, 11, and 14, there weren't any extreme rain events, no big hurricanes or big spring storms. And interestingly, the loads were not, especially high. So I think that just highlights the effects of precip intensity on generating these loads rather than just precip volume. And if you look back to the plots on the left, you'll see that the effect of those intense storms is highlighted in these major step increases in the cumulative loads. So during these three big storm events that I've got circled. So for example, at South Fork Little Difficult, in the sediment figure, 60% of the sediment load generated over that 10-year period was generated from just 3 storm events. Now, nitrogen is a much different story. So you'll notice that these lines are much smoother. So that tells us that nitrogen loads accumulated slowly and steadily over time, largely due to groundwater contributions rather than being driven by those major storm events. And the annual loads, they were very strongly correlated to the total annual stream flow, opposed to those high runoff periods, as was the case with sediment and phosphorus. South Fork Little Difficult yielded the most nitrogen over the 10 years. That was likely influenced by that higher nitrate concentrations that resulted, in part from that high density of septic infrastructure in that watershed. And now if you look to the top right, you'll see that I've broken apart the composition of the total nitrogen load for each of the sites. So I've got it broken down into its 2 main parts. So first of all, I have total nitrogen on there. Then I have the dissolved and particulate fractions, and then also the major portion of the dissolved component, which was nitrate. An important takeaway here is that despite a compositional shift from dissolved to particulate across low base flows to high flows. The majority of loads were composed of that dissolved portion. And in particular, nitrate typically accounted for about 50% of the annual TN load at most of these sites, and as much as 65% at South Fork Little Difficult. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears away from water chemistry. I am not a biologist, but I do my best with these slides. So here we have results from our trend analyses of 20 benthic macroinvertebrate metrics. And these metrics, even more than our nutrient and our sediment and our water quality parameters, they can give us, an indication of stream health, because these insects have to actually live and survive in these streams. I've often read and heard them called living recorders because of their relative immobility and because of their variable sensitivity to urban or other stressors. So now the big takeaway message from the benthic analysis is that the changes that we observed in our 20 benthic metrics suggest that the condition, the function, and the biodiversity of streams in Fairfax County is improving. But many of these improvements are from a greater number of organisms that are tolerant of urban stressors. So instead of going back to where we were pre-development, perhaps we're just establishing a new urban normal, so to speak. So just to quickly walk through a couple of points in this figure. Over that 10-year period, on the network scale, the total number of unique species increased. But then, as I just mentioned, much of that gain was from our more tolerant organisms, so many of which fall into the Cote metric. And the Fairfax IBI increased. So most sites went from poor to fair, or some even from fair to good. And the community overall became less homogeneous, which is a good sign. And that was due to a decrease in the most tolerant organisms. So the previous slide was a quick summary of the benthic analyses as it pertains to a network-wide trends, which basically leverages all the data from all the sites together. But we also performed all these analyses for each individual station. And those analyses yielded some pretty interesting results. So I'm not going to dive into the details of the table here, but in the top right, I'm presenting a table from the report that shows the trend in IBI and several compositional metrics at each station. And then we also have a similar table of the taxa richness metrics in there as well. So in total, we present trends in 20 benthic metrics at 14 sites in the network. So there's a lot of information packed in there. Now back in the figure here, we can see the trend lines for the Fairfax County IBI, and it's interesting. An interesting takeaway here is that it can be seen through comparing Castle Creek, which is the green line, and South Fork Little Difficult, which is the blue line. So the trends at South Fork Little Difficult are similar to most of the sites, and they show kind of a moderate recovery following decades of disturbance. Meanwhile, the conditions at Castle Creek, which is the least developed watershed in the network, were initially the best in the network and had an IBI score in the excellent range. But due to some development in that watershed, the abundance of more tolerant organisms has increased, and the IBI is showing, though non-significant, a declining pattern, and was accompanied by a significant decline in percent EPT, which is that most sensitive taxa group, and increases in the more tolerant taxa. An interesting side note is that sites with a better starting condition at the beginning of the study were more likely to decline over the period, likely due to developmental pressures, whereas sites with the poor or the very poor scores had generally already been heavily developed. So they were more likely to improve as they began to stabilize after some intense disruption in the previous decades. All right, so I know that's a lot of information. I probably moved a little fast, but hopefully you got something out of it. There's the report is out there, so if you really want to deep dive in any of this, it's there. But I will just say, we've only scratched the surface with what we can learn from this network and these data sets. So John's going to now present just a brief look into some of the analyses we're focused on currently.
Sure, thanks, Aaron. If you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So Aaron's talked a lot about what we've observed in our network over the last decade or so, and talked about trends and conditions. And that really leads to the big question of the factors that are driving these responses that we're seeing. Why are things changing in the way that they are? And we know that there are various things that may be driving our water quality and our benthic responses, either in a positive direction or a negative direction. They start with nutrient trends that could be resulting from changing watershed inputs, which may be human and animal waste, fertilizer, atmospheric deposition, or potentially other inputs on the landscape of the watersheds. We know that developed land has expanded, and that's associated with increasing nutrient and sediment loads. We also know that the county has invested heavily in management practices and restoration in efforts to mitigate some of these negative responses. We also know that there's changing climatic conditions that can have variable effects on nitrogen and phosphorus conditions in the streams, depending on how exactly the climate changes. And then finally, we realize that there are potentially other drivers that we've yet to identify. And so we're currently working to evaluate all of these things and develop a better understanding of why we're seeing these changes. So some examples of the analyses that we're currently conducting include thorough analysis of the management practices that have been implemented on the landscapes. We have estimated reductions from those management practices that have been implemented. So we're currently analyzing that in comparison with our monitoring data to see how those compare. We know that these management practices and changes on the landscape will affect the hydrology in these systems. So we're doing a thorough evaluation of our stream flow data to look at how various stream flow metrics like flashiness and time to peak may be changing over time, and relating those changes to BMP implementation and precipitation patterns. We know that the landscape has changed in various ways. We know that forests have been lost to development of housing units, and we know that we've seen an increase in multifamily units. And to support this growing population, we know that the wastewater infrastructure has changed in various ways, including the addition of sanitary sewer lines and septic systems across various parts of the county. And we're also looking at how we can translate those landscape changes to better explain things like the nutrient sources and nutrient responses. So using a variety of different data sets and models that may be available to us to evaluate inputs to the landscape for comparison with what we're seeing in these streams. And these are just a few examples of some of the types of analyses we're currently working on. Not shown here are analyses of ecologic conditions, benthic community structure, and so on, and many other things. So this is all work that's currently underway. It's being led by Jimmy Weber, and we have a report planned in the coming year. So stay tuned for that next report that's really gonna dig into explaining some of these trends that we've observed in the work that Aaron's just presented.
All right, so thanks, John. We're going to completely shift gears now, and I'm going to talk about the Hampton Roads Monitoring Program. And it has many similarities to the Fairfax County network that I just discussed, with a few interesting differences. Namely, we're monitoring within the engineered stormwater infrastructure, so we're in storm drains rather than in earthen streams. And we began this program in 2015 with all sites online by 2016. So to date, we have about 5 years of data. We put out a fact sheet on the network a few years back that's available online. And I'm currently, as John mentioned, working on a USGS report publication that I hope to have out by the end of 2021 or so, or thereabouts. So if your interest has peaked today, look out for that, or send me your email. I can put you on a distribution list. And I'll just say that this is a regional monitoring effort. So we're working with the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, in partnering with HRSD, the Hampton Roads Sanitation District, for some of this work, the field work. And this is in cooperation with the cities of Chesapeake, Hampton, Newport News, Norfolk, Portsmouth, Virginia, and Virginia Beach. So we'll start with an overview of the program and some background on the motivation for the project. So John actually already went over this, but it's kind of the spiel I always give. Data describing urban stormwater nutrient and sediment loading rates in the coastal plain have long been lacking, and this may limit the accuracy of the watershed model and the TMDL allocations for the region. So, as I mentioned, since late 2015, we've been collecting nutrient, sediment, basic water quality, and stream flow data that are relevant to this region, and then we've used those data to compute loads for comparison to the Bay watershed model. Now, the study design includes 12 stations that are in small, highly urbanized watersheds, each collecting high frequency data in both storm and base flow samples for nutrient sediment analysis. Our high frequency data include stream flow, velocity, stage, turbidity, water temperature, and specific conductance, all collected on a 5-minute time step. So that's 24/7, 365. The discrete water samples are collected primarily during storm events, but we also collect a sample on a fixed date each month. So this sampling design allows us for both the computation of annual loads and nutrient and sediment constituents, as well as long-term trends in concentration. And then in addition to these other, the main question, we're interested in how those loads that we're computing compare to other urban areas, how loads vary across land use types, some basic information, about the source of those loads, and just other factors driving variability across, both time and space. I always like to present this slide because I think it's a strong example of why our urban monitoring program is so important, specifically at Chesapeake Bay Science, because these urban environments are so potentially so different than other land use types like agricultural or rural or forested watersheds. So the figure here shows the relation of watershed area versus impervious land cover. So with the gray dots representing the Chesapeake Bay non-tidal network stations, which serve as calibration knobs for the Chesapeake Bay watershed model. And these are relatively large and mostly non-urban watersheds. Then the blue dots the blue dots are the Fairfax County network that we've talked about today. The purple dot is the Lick Run site in Roanoke. And these do a great job of beginning to fill that knowledge gap of smaller, more urbanized watersheds. And then the Hampton Roads watersheds in red take this to the next level, examining very small watersheds that are less than a square mile in size. They're extremely flashy, and half of them have greater than 50% impervious cover. And then I'll just to set up for some of the analyses I'll show on the following slides. It's important to note that that there's an impervious gradient within the network, which largely falls into land use categories, with commercial watersheds having the highest levels of imperviousness and single family residential the lowest. So John went through how we compute loads using the intensive monitoring approach, but I'll just go through it very quickly here. So, with our primary objective being the computation of annual nutrient sediment loads, we've employed a data-rich surrogate regression approach to modeling, which is ideal in these small, flashy, rapidly changing environments. And to conduct this type of monitoring, we've got to collect 3 different elements or pieces of data. So first, we start with the computation of stream flow at each of these sites. And because these are unique environments, we use a combination of our traditional USGS stream gauging methods and then some less traditional methods. And as you can see from the caption box and the photos, stream flow is computed using either a stage discharge rating, an index velocity rating, which basically uses area and continuous velocity readings to compute flow, or a combination of these two methods. And I just mentioned those different methods, just to note that measuring flow in these storm drains, especially in a region like the coastal plain where the water often moves very slowly, during the low flows. It's very difficult. But our team has done just a phenomenal job, I think, combining some great technology and flow meters with just years and years of know-how to produce really high quality records of stream flow that are absolutely essential, to accurate load predictions or load computations. Okay, so now that we have a continuous record of stream flow, we then need to understand the chemistry of the water, of course. And to get that, we need lab analyzed concentration data. So we're collecting samples throughout the range of observed hydrologic conditions throughout time, which includes both seasonal frequency and over the course of years. And we're analyzing those samples for a suite of nutrient and sediment analytes. In addition to manually collecting samples, we use automated samplers that are just really key to monitoring in these systems that are so flashy, because it can be difficult to get to a site, in person to retrieve those really valuable high flow samples while those high flows are actually occurring. And this also allows us, of course, to sample at any hour of the day or night. Okay, so then lastly, I mentioned at the top of this slide that we're computing loads using a surrogate regression approach. So we need our surrogate data, which primarily includes collection of continuous water quality parameters, like in this case, turbidity, water temperature, and specific conductance. And so these are water quality data that can be collected continuously, unlike nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment concentrations. And because a load is just the product of flow and concentration, we want concentration data for every 5-minute increment of time that we have that flow data for. But remember, we only have 40 or so samples throughout each year because lab analyzed samples are, of course, not cheap. And while the samples provide this great snapshot in time of concentration, we need to use our surrogate data to develop a relation with those lab analyzed data to then compute a time series of the continuous concentrations, the nitrate, sediment, and phosphorus, and in this case, every 5 minutes throughout the year. Once we've got continuous concentration and flow data, it's just a simple process of multiplication and aggregation over a time period, like say a year, to get your load. So I'm going to start with a discussion of the data by focusing on stream flashiness again, just a very useful metric in these urban systems. So, hydrologic metrics are the foundation, the bedrock for water quality processes and conditions. So I think it's always best to start with the discussion about hydrology. In a few slides back, I mentioned that we have stations in one of 3 land use types, or maybe I didn't mention that, but and that there's a gradient of imperviousness that's associated with those watersheds. So in the figure, we see flashiness on the y-axis, and the sites and the land uses on the x-axis, and they're colored by their degree of impervious cover. And with a few exceptions, we see the commercial and high density residential areas are flasher than the single family residential basins. Now to look at the larger picture down the bottom there, I'm comparing the Hampton Roads watersheds with those from the Fairfax and Roanoke networks and the Chesapeake Bay non-tidal network sites. In Hampton Roads, they're the green dots in this figure. And what we see is that there's a pretty strong nonlinear relation between watershed size and stream flashiness. But I'd note that the single best predictor of flashiness is, of course, watershed imperviousness. Now, one could certainly say, hey, that's not an apples to apples comparison. You shouldn't compare those larger, less urbanized watersheds with these very small, highly urbanized basins, because there's more going on there than just differences in imperviousness. And while that's true, what I think this highlights is that urban areas can have an outsized effect on the hydrologic cycle and consequently water quality and biological conditions, both in those urban areas and in the downstream environments. So, certainly we need to understand these systems better. They make up a relatively small area of the landscape, but they have a big effect on stream health. Now, we're interested in how hydrology and water quality varies across the Hampton Roads region based on land use. And to examine this, we found study watersheds with exclusive or like nearly exclusive land use of one of a commercial high density residential or single family residential. And we found that both hydrologic, as I talked about on the last slide, and water quality metrics vary across these land use types. And this is likely due to differences in runoff and source inputs. So we see here that for both phosphorus and nitrogen, there's a gradient of increasing concentration from the commercial to the single family basins. So all three types here differ significantly from one another. But we also see that the commercial watersheds yield significantly more runoff than the other two land use types, likely due, of course, to greater impervious cover and greater connection of that imperviousness to stormwater infrastructure. Now, when we examine the loads up in the top right, we see the combined effect of both concentration and flow. So despite having lower concentrations, the commercial watersheds yield more phosphorus and nitrogen than the other two land use types, specifically the single family watersheds, and this is due to the greater runoff. So I'd like to present the Hampton Roads yields in comparison to data from other relevant monitoring networks, because I think it's helpful to put these rates into some context. Otherwise, I think the numbers can be kind of nebulous. So here I'm comparing the yields computed at our 12 Hampton Road sites in blue to USGS monitoring networks in Atlanta and Fairfax County, which both represent urban streams primarily in the Piedmont region. And then also to the Chesapeake Bay non-tidal network sites, which again, we know are very different watersheds, but they are of course relevant because they are calibration knobs of the watershed model, and that ties back into our greater program objective here. So some key takeaways from these plots are that annual total nitrogen yields in Hampton Roads are higher than the NTN, the Chesapeake Bay non-tidal network, and Atlanta networks, but slightly lower than the Fairfax County. Now, on the other hand, nitrate yields in Hampton Roads are on the lower end of the spectrum here. And notably, more of the TN load in those networks, particularly in Fairfax, which I'm showing here in the pie chart, is derived from nitrate, while in Hampton Roads, total nitrogen is largely organic. And that's an important takeaway because, of course, nitrate, is the more bioavailable form of nitrogen. And so just theorizing here, why might organic nitrogen be the more dominant form in Hampton Roads? It might be related to a lack of organisms like benthic shredders that can live and actually survive in these engineered concrete systems. So those organisms are typically responsible for breaking down that coarse particulate matter. But without them, most of that breakdown is probably occurring from bacterial and fungal action, which as a result, that transformation of particulate organic nitrogen into a more bioavailable nitrate is quite slow. Also, it's the surface waters in the coastal plain region, they're quite slow and meandering due to that low topographic slope. So the residence times of these organic materials are quite long. Moving to the two bottom panes, total phosphorus yields in Hampton Roads are higher than the NTN and Atlanta, and they're comparable to Fairfax County. And orthophosphate yields are actually significantly higher in Hampton Roads than any of these other networks. And we don't currently have the analytes to completely speciate phosphorus, but we do see that in Fairfax, the bulk of that total phosphorus load is derived from sediment-bound phosphorus, while in Hampton Roads, while the sediment-bound part is still a large component, orthophosphate's a more substantial component of that TP loading. Now, theorizing again here, one possibility for higher yields is the soil type. So many of you are probably aware that in the coastal plain, the soils are quite sandy. And sand has a very low sorptive capacity for phosphorus. So phosphorus on the landscape, even if it's applied or deposited in low amounts, may simply be more mobile in the soil, and more readily can navigate to the waterways. And again, that slow-moving, meandering waters in the region can be quite anoxic. And under low dissolved oxygen concentrations, phosphorus can disassociate from the soils and organic matter. If we shift over to sediment, as was expected, our prior heading into this, sediment loads are much lower in Hampton Roads than in any of these other urban networks. Definitely note that Unlike the previous slides, I'm using a log scale here. So the differences between Hampton Roads and these other networks is actually considerably larger than it might appear at first glance on this figure. So in the Piedmont, which again is represented by both Fairfax County and Atlanta, there's a combination of both a lot of legacy sediment from past agriculture activities. So there's a lot of available sediment to be mobilized, and there's a steep enough topographic gradient to generate the energy required to mobilize that sediment. But meanwhile, in Hampton Roads, we've got a combination of factors that are driving things in the opposite direction. So we have heavier sandy soils, and we have a low topographic slope, so there's less energy to mobilize those heavy particulates. And then there's a general lack of source or supply, which is due both to the level of impervious cover in our watersheds, and the fact that these channels are generally concrete lined. So there just isn't a lot of available sediment on a concrete or asphalt surface, or erosion occurring from your typical well manicured lawn. And that's not necessarily the case across the entirety of the coastal plain, but it likely is a good representation of this highly urbanized region in which we're monitoring. Okay, so it's very useful to understand how constituents enter the waterway. So the pathway they take can tell us something about their source. And we can get a good sense of that by breaking the load into two flow paths, which is the base flows and the storm flows. So on that bar chart, you'll see the base flow generated portion of the load in red and the storm flow portion in blue. And these are just averages of all of the stations over all years. So half of the nitrate load is actually transported during base flows. This pattern is not unlike what we've observed in other networks, other monitoring networks you'll remember from Fairfax County that I showed earlier. And that tells us that nitrate applied to the landscape, it moves into and is stored within the groundwater, rather than just being transported by runoff alone. And because groundwater isn't necessarily confined to our local watershed boundaries, the source could even be outside the watershed. Though it is worth noting that these storm drains, they're sustained by groundwater infiltration year-round during low flows. And the extremely shallow water table in this region means that the groundwater we're measuring during those low flows in these storm drain pipes is probably quite local. On the other hand, total nitrogen is largely mobilized during storm events, because the bulk of that is particulate-bound organic N, as I talked about on the previous slide. Likewise, the majority of total phosphorus and orthophosphates conveyed during storm events. So that's likely introduced to the stormwater system by wash off from sources like leaves and grass clippings, through the erosion of soil particles, or from orthophosphate, that's mineralized from those organic materials, or washed off from excess fertilizer applications. All right, so that's what I've got from our current data analyses, but I did also want to very quickly share some additional ongoing work at one of the sites in Chesapeake, as well as we've got something similar going on in Roanoke at Lick Run, and an urban stream in Ashland at Meacham's Creek. So this will be brief and oversimplified, but we've been working on a method called large-scale particle image velocimetry. Some of you may have heard of it. It's more commonly known by its acronym LSPIV. And it's a neat new technology that utilizes short video clips that are then decomposed to track particle movement. So whenever there's a storm, the camera's triggered to begin recording a short video clip. And we then take that video and we break it up into hundreds of individual frames. And again, this is a way oversimplification of this process, but we use these images to track the movement of particles, moving across each frame, to ultimately generate flow vectors that estimate the surface velocity of the water through that cross section. And that's what you can see in that top right of the screen. Then with some additional processing shown in the bottom right, we can then take those vectors and turn it into a streamflow value. And depending on the accuracy, and applicability of this method across our networks, the reason I'm excited about is this could really be a game changer for how we do business. We certainly will always need to send folks to the field, but some of these systems are very hard to measure the stream flow at when they are at their peaks or at their high points because they're so flashy. If you can have a camera there that's working 24/7, that not only allows you to get measurements you wouldn't otherwise get, but it keeps people safe and it keeps people out of the rain. So we're very excited about this. And that's all I've got today. I know we went through a lot. I'm excited to take your questions. Just point out again some of our contacts here. So John Jastrom is our program development specialist and has had a big hand in this building this urban monitoring program. My name is Aaron Porter. I run the Fairfax County and Hampton Roads networks, as well as that new network out in the city of Salem. My colleague Jimmy Weber operates the city of Roanoke network, as well as being involved in a lot of Chesapeake Bay science. And then Brendan Foster has taken on the new Reston network. So definitely write that information down, and I hope to hear from you all. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, John. We'll go ahead and open things up for questions. If folks have any, you can put them in the chat box, maybe in a minute, since we don't have a huge crowd still hanging on this morning. Maybe we can just let folks unmute and ask a couple questions, see if we want to get any discussion going. I did have one sort of big picture question, and I saw that there was a clarifying question. Let's start maybe with the clarifying question from Jason. Just what was the percent imperviousness that was associated with the 3 land use types in the Hampton Roads study?
Do you mean the kind of the
I assume
average?
it was the commercial, residential, and I forget what the other classification was that you had in there, but.
Yeah, I'm looking for it. I don't know that offhand. So yeah, it's about 65% in our commercial watersheds, around 50% in the high density residential, and around 40% in the single family. So it's pretty high. I have one site in Hampton that is actually, above 80% impervious.
Okay, great. And then we had a question from Norm about how this data is being used in the calibration for the Chesapeake Bay watershed model. Have you guys been working in terms of incorporating some of that into the calibration process for the Bay program?
Yeah, that absolutely. That is a complex question. Gary Shank, kind of the head of the model, works for our office, so we're in constant contact with him. And as we stated, that's the primary goal for this network is to hopefully use these data and these locally derived loads to better calibrate that model. And they are very excited to get these data. Publishing this report at the end of the year is a big step towards that because they can use our published rates. But it's a little tricky how that's all done. And I would say maybe John can speak to it more, but there's a lot to account for there. There's going to be a new model eventually, and how our data are used in that model. I know that they will be used, but how it's not one-to-one. So I don't know if John wants to add anything.
Yeah, I would say, from conversations with Gary Shank, I think the way he would characterize it is that the data and information from these programs is certainly used to inform the model. It's not used to technically calibrate the model, but it is definitely information that is being considered as the model's developed. And yeah, the same goes for the Fairfax County data. I see a question in the chat.
Great. I did have one kind of other big picture question, and I see there's some others that are coming in the chat as well. Thinking about some of our network members that are outside of Virginia, or don't have one of these monitoring networks sort of set up already. Obviously, the results themselves are very specific to the conditions within these monitoring networks, but I'm wondering, what, if any, kind of takeaways or big picture lessons you think that someone in Maryland or in southeastern Pennsylvania might be able to take from data like these or a presentation like this if they were going to think about either their own monitoring programs or the way that they're targeting some of their implementation based on some of the findings that you guys have seen over the past decade or so of your monitoring network.
Aaron, you want me to take a crack?
Sure, yeah, sure. I was waiting for you. Think you're a big picture guy.
I think it's, definitely what we've seen is that, local site-specific monitoring is really ideal because there are, small differences in watershed characteristics that can lead to major differences in the patterns that we see in water quality. So, I think a big finding about this is that there are a lot of other factors that you may not initially realize that are driving some of the conditions we see in our streams. So, ultimately getting to local monitoring, I think should be the goal. But, in general, I'd say, also, we're obviously seeing that these urbanized systems, are degraded, but we're also seeing in some metrics signals of improvement. So, that's a good thing, but we need to determine what's driving those improvements. And I'm certain that the stormwater managers are hopeful that it's the practices that they're spending so much money on. But as we identified, there's also regional and climatic factors that could be contributing to that too. So, so it's a tricky game.
Great, and you talked a little bit about plans to hopefully expand the monitoring network a little bit. I know you have a couple of stations that you're hoping to bring online in Reston. There was a question about if there were plans to install more locations throughout Hampton Roads, or perhaps if you had any other areas that you were hoping to target in the coming years, if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I'd say, we'd love to expand this in any direction that we can. That happens through cooperation with local groups, and what that means is funding. We require funding support from our partners to do this. So it really depends largely on that. The work in Reston is definitely occurring. That work has been supported by the Resource Protection Group, and we'll certainly be starting this spring. We often lament that, Aaron and I are both in the office in Richmond, and we've got these beautiful monitoring networks kind of in the three corners of the state and nothing in Central Virginia. So it'd be great to, to find some ways to add additional monitoring in central portions of the state as well. And in terms of folks that may be outside of Virginia, USGS has water science centers in every state. So, we have this program in Virginia through the West Virginia Water Science Center, but there's certainly opportunities to partner with, the water science centers in your state. And if you don't know who to contact at those centers, we'd be happy to help you get in touch with those folks.
That would be great. We have a comment also in the chat from Daniel: the importance of communicating the baseline conditions to understand the context around increases and decreases in water quality. For example, a severely impacted site may show improvements, whereas relatively undeveloped locations may see less response or even water quality decreases due to other external factors. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the BMPs are not working. So that kind of ties in, I guess, to some of your points, and hopefully, I guess, your analysis that you're doing in the coming year that kind of ties some of those management actions to some of those responses that you're seeing. Could you maybe elaborate on some of that work just a little bit for folks as a bit of a teaser?
Yeah, I can sorry. No, I was just going to point out one other additional thing before John talks, but I did not mention earlier, but one thing we did in the Hampton Roads network is that we actually selected watersheds that had very minimal, if any, very minimal watershed management or BMP practices implemented, because we did want to establish a baseline for that region. John, do you want to take that further?
Yeah, what I was going to speak to was with the analysis that we're currently doing in Fairfax. We're recognizing that there are factors that are, driving those trends in both directions, and we need to account for them as completely as we can. And I think that's what Daniel was getting to in his comments. So, I think in some cases, what we could find out is that a flat trend or no change over 10 years is actually a positive sign, because there may be regional patterns or local patterns that are really pushing things in the wrong direction, but our management practices have balanced that out. So we're not focused simply on, it must show decreasing loads or something like that to indicate success. We're accounting for those other factors that are pushing those trends in each direction as we evaluate this.
We're just past 11:30, so we'll wrap up in a minute, but we'll take one or two more questions. Casey made a good point, just the importance of funding. There's very limited funding at the local government level for monitoring programs. And while they contribute what they can, the partnerships with USGS and other local agencies like Hampton Roads Sanitation District are really important for localities being able to afford those studies. So just really kind of driving that home, and a bit of a thank you, I guess, to you guys for the work that you do at USGS to help make these monitoring efforts happen with the level of detail that you do. I had one last question for you before I let you go, and this is tied to, as I sort of alluded to, some work that we've been doing at CSN and that is of real interest to the Bay program in particular right now on the stormwater side. And these monitoring timeframes are somewhat short, at least some of the stations looking at 10 years or less. But I was wondering if there's any analysis planned, or if there's been any ability to pick up any sort of climate related signals in some of the changes, whether it's related to the stream flow conditions or the intensity of the precipitation events leading to any of the trends or things that you're seeing in terms of loads and concentrations moving forward, or if that's something that you're going to look at moving ahead as the record lengthens a bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that's on our radar. And I think we'll be able to touch on it in this upcoming report. But yeah, as you mentioned, we really need longer time periods of data to dig into climatic factors. We do have other efforts that are ongoing, related to climate at locations where we have longer records, particularly for stream flow. We've done some work looking at stream temperature changes over time as well. And yeah, as our records lengthen on these programs, I think that'll be something that will be better enabled to evaluate at these sites.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Jason and John, for joining, or Aaron and John for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. This was a really outstanding presentation. It's kind of nice to dig into the details a little bit every once in a while and see what's going on in our urban streams and urban networks. So this is great. I will, as I mentioned, make the recording of the presentation and the slides available for folks who had to hop off or want to take a closer look at some of the charts and figures that are in this presentation. So thank you again. And hopefully we will be able to follow up with you guys in a year or so once you have some of your new analysis ready on some of the other impacts, and we can dig into that a little bit.
Absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for inviting us, David.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Have a good one, everybody.
Take care. Thanks.